When a 17-year-old girl was forced to walk barefoot through 3 inches of snow as punishment for refusing an arranged marriage, she never expected an Apache warrior to risk everything to save her life. But what happened next changed the course of 2 peoples forever. The wind cut through the Mogollon Mountains like a blade made of ice, carrying with it the kind of bitter cold that turned breath into crystals and made even the hardiest frontier folk question their life choices. It was February 15th, 1879, and the Arizona Territory was experiencing the worst winter in a generation. Snow had fallen for 6 straight days, blanketing the high desert in an alien white that transformed familiar landmarks into ghostly shapes. Don Miguel Cruz stood on the covered porch of his adobe hacienda, watching his daughter stumble through the courtyard with the grim satisfaction of a man who believed discipline was the cornerstone of civilization. His leather boots were warm and dry, his woolen coat lined with fur, his gloved hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee that cost more than most men earned in a week. He was 62 years old, the patriarch of one of the largest cattle ranches in the territory, and he had built his empire through a combination of shrewd business sense and iron-fisted control over everything he considered his property. That included his 17-year-old daughter, Serafina. Serafina Cruz moved through the snow like a broken bird, her bare feet leaving bloody prints in the pristine white. She wore only a thin cotton chemise that offered no protection against the brutal cold, her long black hair hanging loose and wet against her shoulders. Each step sent shards of agony shooting up her legs, but she kept walking because the alternative was worse. Her father had made that abundantly clear when he'd stripped her of shoes, coat and dignity 3 hours earlier. The punishment had begun at dawn, when Don Miguel discovered that his carefully arranged marriage contract with Alejandro Vasquez had been rejected by the bride-to-be herself. Serafina had waited until the morning of the betrothal ceremony to announce that she would not marry a man 30 years her senior, regardless of his wealth or her father's business interests. She had spoken her defiance in front of the assembled guests, including Vasquez himself, creating what Don Miguel considered the most humiliating moment of his distinguished life. Serafina had known there would be consequences, but she had underestimated her father's capacity for cruelty. She had expected to be confined to her room, perhaps denied meals for a few days, possibly even sent to the convent in Santa Fe to consider her rebellious ways. She had not expected to be stripped nearly naked and forced to walk barefoot in freezing snow until she came to her senses and agreed to the marriage. Her feet had lost feeling an hour ago, which was both a blessing and a terrible sign. The cold had progressed from painful to numb, and she knew from stories told by the ranch hands that numbness meant frostbite was setting in. But she also knew that if she collapsed or tried to return to the house before her father gave permission, he would simply extend the punishment. Don Miguel Cruz was not a man who bluffed, and he had made it clear that she would walk until she submitted or until the cold made the decision for her. From her father's perspective, this was a reasonable consequence for unreasonable behavior. Serafina was his property, legally and morally, and her value lay in the alliances she could create through marriage. Her thoughts, feelings and preferences were irrelevant luxuries that he had indulged too long. The time for indulgence was over. She would learn obedience, or she would learn the price of defiance, but Serafina had inherited more than her father's stubbornness. Her mother, dead these past 10 years, had been a woman of quiet strength who had taught her daughter that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed hopeless. Maria Elena Cruz had been forced into her own arranged marriage at 16, and though she had never spoken of it directly, Serafina had seen the sadness in her mother's eyes whenever she looked at her husband. It was a sadness that Serafina was determined never to carry. The girl continued her slow circuit of the courtyard, past the well where she had played as a child, past the chapel where she had prayed for her mother's recovery, past the gate that led to freedom, but might as well have been on the moon. Her father watched from the porch, occasionally checking his pocket watch with the air of a man monitoring a business transaction. The ranch hands went about their morning chores with studied indifference, knowing better than to interfere in the patron's family business. What none of them noticed was the figure moving through the pine trees on the ridge above the hacienda. Zephyr Redstone had been tracking a wounded deer when he spotted the strange scene unfolding in the courtyard below. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Why would anyone be walking in the snow, wearing so little clothing? As he watched through the scope of his rifle, the truth became clear, and with it came a rage that surprised him with its intensity. Zephyr was 24 years old, a member of the Chiricahua Apache who had been born into a world where his people were fighting for survival against an expanding American empire. He had spent most of his adult life as a scout and warrior, moving between the reservations and the wild places where Apache bands still lived free. He understood cruelty as a fact of life, had seen it practiced by both his own people and their enemies. But there was something about the deliberate, casual nature of this punishment that struck him as particularly evil. He'd been raised by a grandmother who taught him that strength was measured not by the ability to inflict suffering, but by the wisdom to prevent it when possible. The old woman, Ayanna Redstone, had been a medicine woman who believed that all life was connected, that cruelty toward one was cruelty toward all. She had died 3 years earlier, but Zephyr still heard her voice in moments like this, still felt the weight of her teachings. The Apache warrior studied the scene below, with the patient eye of a hunter. The girl was clearly in distress, her movements becoming more labored with each circuit of the courtyard. The man on the porch showed no signs of ending the punishment, and the other people present were either unable or unwilling to intervene. Without help, the girl would collapse within the hour, and in this cold collapse might well mean death. Zephyr had every reason to ride away and forget what he had seen. His people and the Mexican ranchers were not allies. The Chiricahua had been fighting Mexican troops and settlers for generations, and there was little love lost between them. Interfering in the affairs of Don Miguel Cruz would bring unwanted attention from both Mexican authorities and American cavalry. It was the kind of complication that a smart warrior avoided. But as he watched Serafina stumble and nearly fall, then force herself upright through sheer will, Zephyr made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He began working his way down the ridge, moving with the silent grace that had made him one of the most feared Apache scouts in the territory. His horse, a paint mare named Scylla, followed without need for guidance, sensing her rider's change in mood. The plan that formed in Zephyr's mind was simple and dangerous. He would wait until the girl's path brought her near the courtyard gate, then create a distraction that would allow him to reach her. Once he had her, they would disappear into the mountains before anyone could react. It was the kind of bold, reckless action that his grandmother would have both admired and scolded him for. As Serafina began another circuit of the courtyard, her legs shaking with exhaustion and cold, she had no idea that salvation was approaching through the pine trees above. She was focused entirely on putting one foot in front of the other, on proving to herself that she was stronger than her father's. Cruelty. She had no way of knowing that an Apache warrior had seen her plight and chosen to risk everything to help a stranger. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the snow into a field of diamonds that hurt to look at. Don Miguel checked his watch again and frowned. It had been nearly 4 hours, and his stubborn daughter showed no signs of surrendering. Perhaps it was time to increase the pressure. He was considering his options when the first arrow struck the wooden post beside his head. The Shaft quivered in the weathered wood, its obsidian point buried deep enough to suggest serious intent. Don Miguel dropped his coffee cup, the ceramic shattering on the porch stones as he dove for cover behind a heavy wooden chair. His ranch hands scattered like startled chickens, some running for the barn while others drew their pistols and searched wildly for targets among the pine trees. "Apaches!" shouted Carlos Mendoza, the ranch foreman, his voice cracking with fear. The word sent a chill through the assembled men that had nothing to do with the winter air. Apache raids were a constant threat in this part of the territory, and everyone. New stories of ranches burned, cattle stolen, people killed or taken captive. Don Miguel had always considered his wealth and connections sufficient protection, but wealth meant nothing to a warrior with a bow. A second arrow whistled out of the trees, this one striking the ground near the well where Serafina had paused in her painful march. The girl looked up in confusion, her mind too numbed by cold and exhaustion to immediately process what was happening. She had heard the shouts, seen the men running, but the significance hadn't penetrated the fog that had settled over her thoughts. Zephyr moved through the pines like a ghost, using the terrain and the ranch hand's panic to mask his approach. He had fired the arrows deliberately wide, seeking to create chaos rather than casualties. His goal was distraction, not massacre, though he was prepared for violence if it became necessary. The paint mare followed at a distance, ready to respond to his whistle when the time came. The Apache warrior had spent years perfecting this kind of tactical approach, learned through countless raids and skirmishes with Mexican troops, American cavalry, and rival Apache bands. He understood the psychology of surprise attacks, knew how quickly organized men could become a panicked mob when faced with an unseen enemy. The key was timing. Strike too early and your target might recover. Strike too late and opportunity would pass. "Where are they?" Don Miguel called out from behind his chair, his voice tight with fear and fury. "How many?" He had built his fortune partly through government contracts to supply beef to military posts, and part of that relationship involved sharing intelligence about Apache movements. He was not supposed to be surprised like this, not on his own land, not when he had paid good money for protection. Carlos Mendoza crouched behind the stone wall of the well, his rifle trained on the tree line. "I don't see them, Patron. Could be anywhere up there. Could be 20 warriors, or could be 2. He was an experienced frontiersman who had survived more Apache encounters than he cared to count, and he knew better than to make assumptions about numbers or intentions. The foreman's eyes fell on Serafina, still standing exposed in the center of the courtyard, and he felt a stab of concern that surprised him. Carlos had never approved of Don Miguel's harsh treatment of his daughter, but he had learned long ago that questioning the patron's decisions was a quick way to find yourself looking for new employment. Still, leaving the girl in the open during an Apache attack seemed like madness. "Señorita," he called out, "Venga, aquí, come here quickly." But Serafina seemed not to hear him. She stood swaying in the snow, her face turned toward the mountains, as if she were listening for something only she could perceive. The cold had dulled her senses and slowed her reactions, making her an easy target for any warrior with hostile intent. Zephyr saw his opportunity. The girl was isolated in the courtyard while the men were focused on the trees above. If he moved quickly and quietly, he could reach her before anyone realized what was happening. He began his descent, using the cover of rocks and brush to mask his movement, his moccasined feet finding purchase on surfaces that would have defeated boots. Behind the cover of the porch pillars, Don Miguel was calculating odds and options. If this was a major Apache raid, his best hope was to hold them off until help arrived from the territorial militia post 15 miles away. But if it was a smaller group looking for easy plunder, they might be willing to negotiate. He had dealt with Apache leaders before, trading cattle and supplies for safe passage through their traditional hunting grounds. The rancher's thoughts. were interrupted by a third arrow, this one embedding itself in the doorframe, just inches from where he crouched. The message was clear. The attackers knew exactly where he was and could have killed him already if that had been their intention. This suggested they wanted something other than his death, which opened possibilities for bargaining. Escuchen, Don Miguel called out in Spanish, then switched to the broken Apache he had learned from prisoners and traders. Listen, we can talk. What do you want? His voice echoed across the courtyard, met by silence from the trees. The only sounds were the nervous breathing of his men and the soft whisper of wind through pine needles. Serafina heard her father's words, as if from a great distance. The cold had created a strange clarity in her mind, stripping away everything except essential thoughts and perceptions. She understood that Apache warriors were nearby, that her father was afraid, that she was standing in the middle of whatever was about to unfold. But instead of terror, she felt only a curious sense of anticipation, as if something important was finally beginning. The girl had grown up on stories of Apache raids and rescues, tales told by ranch hands around campfires. During roundups, most were stories of violence and tragedy, but some spoke of Apache honor and unexpected mercy. Her mother had once told her a different kind of story, about an Apache warrior who had saved a Mexican woman from bandits and asked nothing in return, except that she remembered kindness when she encountered it. Maria Elena Cruz had been full of such stories, parables that seemed designed to teach lessons about compassion and courage. Serafina had dismissed many of them as romantic nonsense, but standing in the snow with arrows whistling overhead, she found herself remembering her mother's words about strength taking many forms, some of them unexpected. Zephyr reached the edge of the courtyard and paused, studying the scene with a warrior's eye for detail. The girl was perhaps 30 yards away, clearly suffering from exposure, but still standing upright. The men with guns were focused on the trees above, not watching the approaches from ground level. If he moved during the next distraction, he could reach her before anyone could react. The Apache warrior knocked another arrow and drew his bow, aiming this time for the bell tower of the small chapel. The bronze bell rang out as the arrow struck it, the sound echoing across the valley like a call to battle. Every head turned toward the chapel, every gun swung in that direction, and in that moment of distraction, Zephyr sprinted across the open ground. He moved like liquid shadow, his feet barely disturbing the snow as he closed the distance to Serafina. She saw him coming and felt no fear, only a strange recognition, as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. The Apache warrior was tall and lean, his face painted with traditional war markings, his long black hair adorned with eagle feathers that caught the morning light. "Do not be afraid," Zephyr said in Spanish as he reached her, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am here to help." Without waiting for her response, he swept his heavy winter blanket from his shoulders and wrapped it around her trembling form. The wool was warm with his body heat and smelled of sage, smoke, and mountain air, enveloping her like an embrace from the earth itself. Serafina looked up into his face and saw something that took her breath away. His eyes held no cruelty, no calculation, no demand for submission. Instead, she saw concern and determination, the look of someone who had chosen to risk everything for a stranger's welfare. It was so different from her father's cold authority that she felt tears freeze on her cheeks. "Can you ride?" Zephyr asked, already lifting her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her body light with hunger and cold, and he could feel the violent shivering that racked her frame. Time was running short. Soon the men would realize that the chapel had been a diversion, would turn back to scan the courtyard, and then the real danger would begin. "I think so," Serafina whispered, her voice barely audible. She had been an accomplished horsewoman before her father's punishment began, but her current condition made everything uncertain. Still, the thought of escaping this nightmare gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Zephyr whistled sharply, a sound that cut through the morning air like a blade. Within seconds, his paint mare appeared at the courtyard gate, moving with the trained precision of a war horse. Scylla had carried him through dozens of dangerous situations, and she knew that the whistle meant urgency, meant that her rider needed her speed and sure-footedness to survive. The horse's arrival finally caught the attention of the ranch hands. Carlos Mendoza turned from his vigil at the chapel and saw an Apache warrior holding Don Miguel's daughter, saw the painted horse waiting at the gate, understood immediately what was happening. "El Apache tiene a la niña!" the foreman shouted. "The Apache has the girl!" His rifle swung toward the courtyard, but the angle was wrong, and he couldn't fire without risking Serafina's life. The other men faced the same dilemma. Their patron's daughter was human shield and hostage, protected by her captor's presence. Don Miguel emerged from behind his chair, his face purple with rage and fear. This was not how the morning was supposed to unfold. He had been teaching his daughter a lesson about obedience and respect, asserting his authority as patriarch and head of the family. Now that authority was being challenged by a savage who understood nothing of civilization or proper order. "Release my daughter!" he shouted in Spanish, then repeated the demand in his broken Apache. "Take cattle, take horses, take whatever you want, but leave her here." His voice cracked with desperation. Whatever his faults as a father, Don Miguel genuinely loved Serafina in his own controlling way, and the thought of losing her to Apache captivity filled him with terror. Zephyr paused at the gate, Serafina cradled against his chest, and turned to face the rancher. When he spoke, his Spanish was perfect, educated, nothing like the broken dialect that Don Miguel expected from a savage. "I want nothing from you, senor, except to end your cruelty to this child. No father who truly loves his daughter would force her to walk barefoot in snow as punishment for refusing an unwanted marriage." His voice carried across the courtyard with quiet authority. "She comes with me because she chooses freedom over your chains." The words hit Don Miguel like physical blows. How did this Apache know about the marriage, about the punishment, about the private family matters that should have been none of his concern? The rancher's world was built on the assumption that his authority was absolute within his own domain, that outsiders had no right to judge or interfere with his decisions. "She is my daughter," Don Miguel roared. "My property by law and by right. You have no claim on her." But even as he spoke the words, he could see doubt in the eyes of his own men. The sight of Serafina wrapped in the warrior's blanket, her face peaceful for the first time in hours, created an uncomfortable contrast with the image of her walking barefoot in the snow. Zephyr lifted Serafina onto Scylla's back, then swung up behind her. The paint mare danced nervously, sensing the tension in the air and the hostile intent of the armed men surrounding them. But her rider's hands were steady on the reins, and his voice was calm when he spoke to her in Apache, telling her to be ready for a hard run through dangerous country. "Goodbye, father," Serafina said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "I hope someday you will understand that love cannot be built on fear, and respect cannot be earned through cruelty." She spoke with a dignity that surprised everyone present, including herself. The nearness of death had stripped away pretense and revealed something steel-strong at her core. Don Miguel stared at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time. Wrapped in the Apache warrior's blanket, sitting straight and proud despite her ordeal, she looked more like her mother than ever before. Maria Elena had possessed the same quiet strength, the same refusal to be broken by harsh treatment. For a moment the rancher felt a stab of something that might have been regret, but the moment passed, replaced by fury at this challenge to his authority. "Shoot him!" he ordered his men. "Shoot the savage and bring back my daughter!" But the ranch hands hesitated. The Apache warrior and Seraphina were too close together, the risk of hitting her too great. Besides, something about the entire situation felt wrong, felt like they would be shooting the wrong person. Zephyr urged Scylla into motion, and the paint mare responded with the explosive speed that had saved both their lives on countless occasions. They burst through the gate and onto the mountain trail, snow flying from the horse's hooves as she found her footing on the treacherous path. Behind them, the shouts of angry men faded into the whisper of wind through pine trees as they climbed. Into the high country, Seraphina felt warmth returning to her body for the first time in hours. The Apache warrior's arms were strong around her, keeping her steady in the saddle, and his blanket was like a cocoon of safety and comfort. She had no idea where they were going or what would happen next, but for the moment it was enough to be free of her father's courtyard and the endless circuit of frozen ground. The mountain trail twisted upward through stands of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, the snow-covered path treacherous enough to challenge even Scylla's sure-footed navigation. Zephyr guided the paint mare with subtle shifts of weight and pressure, his body moving in harmony with the horse's rhythm as they climbed toward the high country. Behind him, Seraphina clung to the saddle horn with fingers that were slowly regaining feeling, her body pressed against his back for warmth and stability. 3 miles from the crew's hacienda, Zephyr turned onto a barely visible game trail that wound between massive granite boulders and disappeared into a grove of ancient oaks. The trees formed a natural shelter, their interlocking branches creating a canopy that had kept most of the snow from reaching the ground beneath. Here, protected from the wind and hidden from pursuit, the Apache warrior finally allowed Scylla to stop. Seraphina slid from the horse's back with Zephyr's steadying hand on her arm, her legs trembling from cold and exhaustion. She had not spoken during the harrowing ride up the mountain, partly from fear and partly because the situation was so far beyond her experience that words seemed inadequate. Now, standing in the relative shelter of the oak grove, she found herself face to face with the man who had risked everything to save her life. Zephyr Redstone was unlike any person she had ever encountered. His skin was bronze dark from years in the sun, marked with scars that spoke of battles fought and survived. His black hair fell past his shoulders, braided with strips of leather and decorated with feathers that caught the filtered sunlight. He wore traditional Apache clothing, buckskin leggings, a cotton shirt dyed deep blue, and moccasins that looked handmade. A knife and tomahawk hung from his belt, alongside a parfleche bag decorated with intricate beadwork. But it was his eyes that held her attention. They were dark brown, almost black, and filled with an intelligence that contradicted everything she had been taught about Apache savagery. When he looked at her, she saw compassion and concern, but also a wariness that suggested he was as uncertain about this situation as she was. He had rescued her impulsively, she realized, without fully considering the consequences. "Are you injured?" Zephyr asked in Spanish, his voice gentle but businesslike. He was studying her with the practiced eye of someone who had treated battlefield wounds and knew the signs of serious damage. The blue-white tinge around her lips suggested hypothermia, and the way she favored her left foot indicated frostbite or worse. Seraphina shook her head, then immediately contradicted herself. "My feet," she whispered, looking down at the blood-stained snow where she stood. "I cannot feel them anymore." The admission frightened her more than she wanted to admit. She had heard stories of frostbite victims losing toes or entire feet to gangrene, becoming crippled for life because of exposure to extreme cold. Without hesitation, Zephyr knelt in the snow and began examining her feet with the careful touch of someone who understood the dangers of cold injury. His hands were warm and surprisingly gentle as he assessed the damage. "Frostbite, but not severe," he said after a moment. "The bleeding means circulation is still working. We need to warm them slowly, carefully. Too fast, and the pain will be..." Unbearable. He rose and moved to his saddlebags, retrieving items that Serafina could not identify. There was a small metal pot, packets of herbs wrapped in oiled cloth, a fire-starting kit that looked different from anything she had seen before. His movements were economical and purposeful, suggesting someone who had dealt with emergencies in wilderness settings many times before. "Sit here," Zephyr said, indicating a fallen log that provided a natural bench. "Keep the blanket wrapped. Around you, I will build a fire and prepare something to help with the cold damage." His tone was matter-of-fact, neither condescending nor overly sympathetic. He was treating her as a person capable of following instructions, not as a helpless victim, requiring rescue. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The fire he built was small and smokeless, constructed with the skill of someone who understood that visibility could mean death in hostile territory. Dry tinder caught quickly, and soon small flames were licking at carefully arranged kindling. He filled the metal pot with clean snow and suspended it over the fire on a tripod made from green branches. While the water heated, Zephyr opened his parfleche bag and began sorting through its contents. Serafina watched in fascination as he laid out materials she had never seen before. Dried plants that looked like nothing in her father's garden, small bottles containing powders and liquids, tools that might have been medical instruments or might have been something else entirely. "You are a medicine man?" she asked, curiosity overcoming her shyness. The question seemed natural given what she was observing, but she immediately worried that it might be inappropriate or offensive. Her knowledge of Apache culture was limited to the hostile stereotypes, promoted by territorial newspapers and military reports. Zephyr glanced up from his preparations, a slight smile softening his serious expression. "I learned healing from my grandmother, but I'm not a medicine man in the traditional sense. She taught me because she said warriors who understand how to heal are more valuable than those who only know how to destroy." His Spanish was not just fluent but elegant, suggesting an education that contradicted assumptions about Apache ignorance. The water in the pot began to steam, and Zephyr added pinches of various herbs, creating a mixture that smelled of sage and something sharper, more medicinal. He stirred the concoction with a wooden stick, testing the temperature with his finger until he was satisfied. "This will help restore circulation and prevent infection," he explained, removing the pot from the fire. Serafina watched as he knelt beside her feet, handling the hot liquid with casual expertise. The first touch of the herbal wash against her frozen skin sent lightning bolts of pain up her legs, making her gasp and clench her hands. But Zephyr's touch remained gentle and steady, his voice calm as he explained what was happening. "The pain means your body is coming back to life," he said. "It will get worse before it gets better, but that is normal. The alternative is losing parts of your feet to the cold." His matter-of-fact delivery helped her endure the agony of sensation, return to tissues that had been numb for hours. Tears streamed down her face, but she did not cry out. As he worked, Zephyr told her about his grandmother's teaching, how Ayana Redstone had been renowned among the Chiricahua for her knowledge of plants and healing practices. She said that medicine was like warfare turned inside out. Instead of finding ways to harm, you learned ways to help. But both required understanding how the body worked, how it responded to different treatments. The stories helped distract Serafina from the pain as circulation gradually returned to her feet. She learned that Zephyr had been raised by his grandmother after his parents died in a cavalry attack on their winter camp. Ayana had taught him not just healing, but languages, diplomacy, and the complex art of survival in a world where being Apache meant being hunted. She spoke 7 languages, Zephyr said, wrapping Serafina's feet in strips of soft cloth that smelled of cedar and sage. Spanish, English, French, and 4 different Apache dialects. She believed that understanding your enemies was the first step toward surviving them. His hands worked with practiced efficiency, creating bandages that were both protective and medicinal. When the immediate treatment was finished, Zephyr built up the fire and began preparing food. From his saddlebags came dried meat, parched corn, and something that looked like pressed cakes made from berries and fat. It was traveler's food, designed for nutrition and portability rather than pleasure. But to Serafina, it smelled like the most wonderful meal she had ever encountered. She realized with surprise that she was ravenous. The punishment march had consumed what little energy her breakfast had provided, and the shock of rescue had temporarily masked her hunger. Now, sitting by a warm fire with her feet properly tended, her body was demanding fuel for recovery. "Eat slowly," Zephyr advised, handing her a portion of the meat and corn mixture. "Your stomach has been empty too long. Too much food too fast will make you sick." He settled beside her with his own meal, maintaining a respectful distance while staying close enough to help if she needed assistance. The food was unlike anything from her father's table, but it was exactly what her body craved. The dried meat was salty and satisfying. The corn provided energy, and the berry cakes offered sweetness that her depleted system desperately needed. As she ate, Serafina felt strength flowing back into her body like water into a dry riverbed. "Why did you help me?" she asked when the worst of her hunger was satisfied. It was the question that had been haunting her since the moment he wrapped her in his blanket. "You do not know me. I am the daughter of a man who pays soldiers to hunt your people. Helping me could bring terrible consequences." Zephyr was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if the flames might provide answers to complicated questions. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, measured. "My grandmother taught me that we are all connected, that cruelty toward one person diminishes everyone. What your father was doing to you was wrong, regardless of your family name or the color of your skin. But it was more than that," he continued, glancing at her with something that might have been embarrassment. "I watched you walk in that snow for an hour before I acted. I saw you fall and force yourself back up, saw you refuse to surrender, even when surrender would have ended your suffering. That kind of strength deserves respect, not punishment." Serafina felt warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the herbal treatment. No one had ever spoken of her strength before, had ever suggested that her stubbornness might be a virtue, rather than a character flaw. Her father saw her refusal to submit as disobedience. Her intended husband had called it unwomanly pride, but this Apache warrior recognized it as something valuable. "I do not feel strong," she admitted. "I feel frightened and confused and completely unprepared for whatever comes next." The honesty surprised her. She had been raised to present a composed facade regardless of her inner turmoil, but something about Zephyr's directness invited equal openness. "Fear and strength are not opposites," Zephyr said. "The bravest warriors I know are afraid before every battle. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is acting rightly despite fear." He added another piece of wood to the fire, sending sparks dancing upward into the grey afternoon sky. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in private thoughts. Serafina was trying to process the dramatic change in her circumstances, the shift from hopeless captivity to uncertain freedom. Zephyr was calculating risks and options, considering how to keep them both alive in territory where an Apache warrior traveling with a Mexican rancher's daughter would be shot on sight by representatives of either culture. "What happens now?" Serafina asked eventually. The question hung between them like a bridge they both needed to cross. She had no illusions about returning to her father's house, not after what had transpired. But she also had no alternative destinations, no resources, no experience with survival in the wilderness. Zephyr studied her face in the firelight, trying to read her emotional state and her physical condition. That depends on what you want, he said carefully. I can take you to a settlement where there are people who will care for you. Or I can take you to my grandmother's sister who lives with a mixed band in the mountains. She would welcome you if I asked. The options he presented were both terrifying and liberating. Either choice meant abandoning the life she had known, accepting exile from the only world she understood. But that world had offered her nothing except forced marriage and brutal punishment for independent thought. Perhaps exile was another word for freedom. What would you do, she asked. If you were in my situation, what choice would you make? She was not seeking someone to make her decision, but rather testing his judgment, trying to understand the kind of person who had risked everything to help a stranger. Zephyr smiled, the expression transforming his serious face and making him look younger, more approachable. I would choose the path that led toward learning rather than safety, but I am probably not the best person to ask about making sensible decisions. Sensible people do not rescue ranchers' daughters from their own fathers. His honesty was refreshing. After a lifetime of people telling her what they thought she wanted to hear, then I choose learning, Serafina said with more confidence than she felt. I choose to go with you to your grandmother's sister to see what life looks like beyond the walls of my father's world. Zephyr nodded as if he had expected this answer. It will not be easy, he warned. Living with the Chiricahua means constant movement, always watching for enemies, never knowing when soldiers might attack. It means learning new ways of doing everything, from finding food to making shelter. Are you prepared for that kind of life? I am prepared to try, Serafina replied. Whatever hardships await, they cannot be worse than walking barefoot in snow as punishment for wanting to choose my own husband. She met his eyes directly, letting him see the determination that had carried her through the morning's ordeal. As if summoned by her words, the sound of distant voices drifted up the mountain, carried on the wind like a threat made audible. Zephyr was on his feet instantly, every sense alert, his hand moving instinctively to his knife handle. Your father's men, he said quietly. They are tracking us. Serafina felt her heart race, but she did not panic. Instead, she began gathering the supplies Zephyr had used to treat her feet, moving with efficiency, born of necessity rather than experience. How much time do we have? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear that made her hands shake. Not much, Zephyr replied, already scattering the fire and erasing signs of their presence. But enough, if we move quickly. He saddled Sila with practiced speed while Serafina wrapped herself in the blanket and prepared for another difficult ride through dangerous territory. As they mounted the paint mare and prepared to disappear deeper into the mountains, Serafina realized that she was no longer the same person who had walked barefoot in her father's courtyard that morning. Something fundamental had changed during the hours beside Zephyr's fire, something that went beyond physical healing and warm food. She had glimpsed a different way of being in the world, one based on mutual respect rather than domination, on strength that included gentleness rather than strength that required cruelty. It was a vision that terrified and inspired her in equal measure, but it was unmistakably her own choice. Behind them, the voices of pursuit grew closer, but ahead lay the vast wilderness of the Apache homeland, dangerous and beautiful and full of possibilities that existed beyond the narrow confines of her former life. For the first time in years, Serafina felt truly alive. The Apache camp materialized from the landscape like a mirage becoming real, hidden so cleverly among the red rocks and twisted junipers that Serafina would have ridden past it without noticing if Zephyr had not guided Sila directly toward what appeared to be empty wilderness. As they drew closer, she began to distinguish wickiups from boulders, cookfires from natural stone formations, and people from shadows that had seemed part of the desert itself. Nahale Redstone emerged from her dwelling like a force of nature given human form. her presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the camp. She was perhaps 60 years old, her silver-streaked hair braided with turquoise and shell, beads that clicked softly as she moved. Her weathered face bore the kind of dignity that came from surviving decades of war, displacement, and loss, while never surrendering the essential core of who she was. When her dark eyes settled on Serafina, the Mexican girl felt as though she were being examined by someone who could see through flesh and bone to the soul beneath. "Grandmother," Zephyr said in Apache, using the term of respect rather than indicating actual kinship. "I bring someone who needs sanctuary. She has been cast out by her own people for refusing to accept cruelty as love." His formal tone suggested that this was not a casual request, but rather an appeal to ancient laws of hospitality and protection. Nahale studied Serafina with the intensity of a hawk evaluating potential prey, taking in every detail from the girl's torn feet wrapped in Zephyr's makeshift bandages to the way she held herself despite obvious exhaustion and fear. The examination was thorough and uncomfortable, but not unkind. It was the assessment of someone who had learned through bitter experience that survival often depended on accurately judging character in strangers. "She is the daughter of the rancher who pays soldiers to hunt us," Nahal said in Spanish, switching languages with the casual fluency of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating between cultures. Her words were not an accusation, but rather a statement of fact that needed to be acknowledged before any decisions could be made. Don Miguel Cruz has offered bounties for Apache scalps and provides beef to the cavalry posts that launch attacks against our people. Serafina felt the weight of inherited guilt settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. She had always known about her father's government contracts, had understood vaguely that his wealth came partly from supplying military operations, but she had never forced herself to confront what those operations actually meant for the people they targeted. Now, surrounded by the survivors of those operations, her ignorance felt like complicity. "I cannot change what my father has done," Serafina said quietly, meeting Nahale's penetrating gaze without flinching. "But I can choose not to continue his path. I have already chosen to refuse the marriage he arranged, to accept exile rather than submit to his authority. If you will have me, I will learn to earn my place among you through service rather than birthright." Something shifted in Nahale's expression, a softening that suggested Serafina had passed some kind of test. The old woman stepped closer, close enough to touch the girl's face with fingers that were surprisingly gentle despite their obvious strength. "You speak like someone who understands that actions matter more than blood," she said. "That is wisdom that many people never learn, regardless of their heritage." The camp was smaller than Serafina had expected, perhaps 30 people including children, but it functioned with the smooth efficiency of a community that had learned to survive under constant threat. Every person had multiple roles and responsibilities, every resource was shared according to need, and every decision was made with consideration for the group's security and mobility. It was unlike anything in Serafina's previous experience, where hierarchy and individual ownership had been the organizing principles of social life. Nahale assigned Serafina to share a wiki-up with Desba, a woman in her 20s who had lost her husband in a cavalry attack the previous year. Desba spoke no Spanish, but possessed seemingly infinite patience for teaching practical skills through demonstration and repetition. Within days, Serafina was learning to identify edible plants, to weave baskets from willow shoots, and to prepare traditional foods that bore no resemblance to the elaborate Mexican cuisine of her father's table. The learning process was humbling in ways that Serafina had not anticipated. Skills that she had considered beneath her attention as the daughter of a wealthy rancher proved essential for survival in the Apache way of life. She discovered that she did not know how to make fire without matches, how to find water in, apparently, barren landscape, or how to read weather signs that could mean the difference between life and death for travelers in the high desert. But more challenging than acquiring practical skills was adapting to a social structure that operated according to principles she was still struggling to understand. Decision-making was a collective process that involved lengthy discussions among the adults, with particular attention paid to the opinions of women whose counsel seemed to carry equal weight with that of the men. Leadership was fluid rather than fixed, changing according to the nature of the challenge being addressed. Zephyr had warned her that Apache life meant constant movement, but she had not fully grasped what that meant until the camp began preparing for its first relocation. Since her arrival, in the space of 2 hours, the entire community disassembled their temporary settlement, loaded everything they owned onto horses and travois, and transformed from sedentary villagers into a mobile hunting party capable of disappearing into the landscape without a trace. Serafina found herself assigned to help with the horse herd, a responsibility that initially seemed natural given her previous experience with riding. But she quickly discovered that managing Apache ponies bore little resemblance to the genteel equestrian activities she had enjoyed at her father's ranch. These animals were half-wild creatures whose cooperation had to be earned rather than commanded, and they possessed an uncanny ability to sense fear or uncertainty in their handlers. "The horses know who can be trusted," explained Casa, a teenage boy who served as one of the camp's horse wranglers. He spoke in a mixture of Spanish and broken English, supplemented by elaborate gestures that somehow made his meaning clear. "They understand courage better than people do. If you try to force them, they will fight. If you ask them to work with you, they will give you everything." The insight applied to more than horse management, Serafina realized as she struggled to establish relationships with both animals and people in her new environment. Force and domination, the tools her father had used to control his world, were not only ineffective in Apache society, but actively counterproductive. Success required a different approach entirely, one based on earning respect rather than demanding obedience. Her first real test came during a hunting expedition led by Goyakla, a warrior whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched by his fierce independence from both American and Mexican authority. The hunting party was tracking a small herd of deer through terrain that would have challenged experienced riders, and Serafina had been included partly as a learning opportunity and partly because her horse handling skills were genuinely needed. The hunt itself was a revelation of Apache tactical sophistication, involving complex coordination between riders, trackers, and hunters positioned at strategic points along the deer's likely escape routes. Every participant understood their role without extensive discussion, and the execution was flawless despite the challenging conditions. When the hunters returned to camp with enough meat to feed the community for days, Serafina felt pride in her small contribution to the group's success. But the real significance of her inclusion in the hunting party became clear that evening, when Nahal announced that Serafina would begin receiving formal instruction in traditional Apache skills from the Women's Council. It was recognition that she was no longer simply a refugee being sheltered temporarily, but rather a potential member of the community who might someday contribute meaningfully to its survival. The instruction was intensive and sometimes overwhelming, covering everything from medicinal plant identification to the complex protocols that governed interactions between Apache bands. Serafina learned that what outsiders saw as a single Apache people was actually a collection of related but distinct groups, each with its own territory, customs, and political relationships. Understanding these distinctions was essential for anyone who hoped to navigate Apache society successfully. One of her most demanding teachers was Itza, an elderly woman whose knowledge of plants and their properties rivaled that of any university-trained physician. Itza spoke only Apache, forcing Serafina to develop basic conversational skills in a language that bore no resemblance to the Spanish and English she already knew. The process was frustrating but necessary, since much of Apache cultural knowledge was embedded in linguistic concepts that had no direct translations. Medicine is not just about healing bodies, Itza explained during one of their field expeditions, speaking slowly so that Serafina could follow her Apache words. It is about understanding the connections between all living things, about knowing how to restore balance when it has been disrupted. This knowledge cannot be learned from books. It must be absorbed through experience, through relationship with the plants themselves. The old woman's teaching methods were unlike anything Serafina had encountered in her formal education at the convent school in Santa Fe. Instead of memorizing lists of facts, she was expected to develop intuitive understanding through careful observation and hands-on experimentation. Instead of accepting information on authority, she was encouraged to test everything through practical application and personal experience. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Serafina found herself settling into rhythms of life that felt increasingly natural despite their initial strangeness. She woke before dawn to help tend the horses, spent her mornings learning traditional skills from the Women's Council, contributed to communal tasks during the afternoon, and ended her days around the evening fire listening to stories that encoded centuries of accumulated wisdom. The stories were particularly fascinating because they offered perspectives on historical events that contradicted everything she had learned about Apache-Mexican relations. From the Apache point of view, they were not bloodthirsty savages attacking innocent settlers, but rather people defending their ancestral homeland against foreign invasion. The raids that territorial newspapers described as unprovoked aggression were actually responses to broken treaties and unpunished massacres of Apache civilians. "Your people see us as the problem," Nahali explained one evening as they worked together, preparing hides for tanning. "But we were here for thousands of years before the first Spanish soldier crossed the Rio Grande. We had our own laws, our own ways of managing the land, our own relationships with other tribes. The conflicts began when outsiders decided that our existence was incompatible with their expansion." These conversations were painful for Serafina because they forced her to confront the fact that her comfortable childhood had been built on a foundation of violence and dispossession that she had never been encouraged to examine. Her father's wealth came not just from cattle ranching, but from participation in a system that treated Apache land as vacant territory available for seizure and Apache people as obstacles to be removed by whatever means necessary. But understanding the historical context also helped her appreciate why her acceptance into the community represented such a significant act of generosity. Every person in the camp had lost family members, friends, or homeland to the expanding frontier. They had every reason to view any Mexican as an enemy, yet they had chosen to evaluate her as an individual rather than condemning her for her ancestry. The transformation was gradual, but unmistakable. Serafina's hands became calloused from unfamiliar work, her skin darkened from constant exposure to sun and wind, and her body grew lean and strong from the physical demands of nomadic life. More importantly, her thinking began to change as she absorbed Apache values and perspectives that challenged assumptions she had never thought to question. By late spring, she was no longer the frightened girl who had been rescued from her father's courtyard. She could identify dozens of edible and medicinal plants, could track animals through terrain that would have seemed trackless to her former self, and could communicate effectively in 3 languages, including basic Apache. She had earned the respect of people whose approval could not be bought or inherited, only deserved through consistent demonstration of character and competence. The most significant change, however, was in her relationship with Zephyr. What had begun as gratitude for rescue and friendship born of shared circumstances had evolved into something deeper and more complex. They worked together easily, communicated with increasing intimacy, and found themselves seeking each other's in company even when practical necessity did not require it. "You have become someone different," Zephyr observed one evening as they sat apart from the main camp, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Not just in skills and knowledge, but in who you are underneath. The girl who walked in the snow was strong, but she was also trapped by other people's expectations. This woman chooses her own path." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Serafina considered his words carefully before responding. "I think the person I am now was always there, waiting for circumstances that would allow her to emerge. Your grandmother's people did not create new qualities in me. They simply provided an environment where existing qualities could grow and flourish." She paused, then added more quietly, "The same could be said of our friendship." The acknowledgement hung between them like a bridge they could choose to cross or leave unexplored. Both understood that their growing closeness carried implications that extended beyond personal feelings to encompass questions of cultural identity, community acceptance, and the practical challenges of building a life together in a world that viewed their relationship as impossible. "What do you want from the future?" Zephyr asked, his voice careful but direct. "Not what you think you should want or what others expect you to want. What do you actually desire for your own life?" It was the question that had been implicit in their interactions for months. Finally spoken aloud, Serafina looked out across the desert landscape that had become more familiar and welcoming than the comfortable rooms of her father's hacienda. "I want to continue learning from your people," she said slowly. "I want to develop skills that make me genuinely useful to the community, rather than simply tolerated as a curiosity. And I want to explore what is growing between us to see if it can become something lasting and meaningful." Her honesty was rewarded by Zephyr's smile, the expression transforming his serious face with warmth that made her heart race. "Then we will build that future together," he said, reaching for her hand. "One choice at a time. One day at a time, until we have created something that belongs completely to us." As if summoned by their moment of intimate connection, a scout rode into camp with news that would test everything Serafina had learned about courage, loyalty, and the price of choosing love over safety. The message he carried would force her to decide once and for all where her true allegiance lay, and whether the person she had become was strong enough to survive what was coming. The scout's name was Chato, and the dust on his horse's flanks told of a hard ride across dangerous territory. He had ridden for 3 days without rest, changing horses twice at hidden way stations to bring news that would reshape the destiny of every Apache band in the southwest. As he dismounted near the council fire, his weathered face bore the grim expression of a man carrying information that no one wanted to hear, but everyone needed to know. General George Crook had been replaced by General Nelson Miles, and the new commander was implementing a strategy of total warfare that made his predecessor's campaigns look like diplomatic negotiations. Miles had tripled the number of troops in the field, established a network of heliograph stations that could communicate across hundreds of miles in minutes, and most ominously had begun recruiting Apache scouts from reservation populations. With promises of payment and pardons for past raids. "He is turning us against each other," Chato reported to the assembled council, his voice hoarse from the long ride and the bitter taste of betrayal. Apache scouts leading bluecoat soldiers. 2 Apache camps. Brothers hunting brothers for American gold. The old ways of warfare, where we could disappear into the mountains and emerge where enemies least expected, no longer work when our own people know all the hiding places. Nahal listened to the scout's report with the stoic composure of someone who had survived too many disasters to be surprised by the arrival of another, but Serafina could see the pain flickering behind her dark eyes. The weaponization of internal divisions was the oldest and most effective tool of conquest, and Miles was deploying it with ruthless efficiency. Apache unity, always fragile due to the independence of individual bands, was being systematically destroyed. "What does this mean for us?" asked Goyakla, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The warrior's reputation for tactical brilliance had made him one of Miles's primary targets, and there were rumors that the general had placed a personal bounty on his capture that exceeded the annual salary of most territorial officials. Chatto's response was grimmer than anyone had expected. "It means the old life is ending. The reservations are no longer temporary refuges, but permanent prisons. The mountains that have sheltered our people for 1,000 generations are being mapped by surveyors and crossed by telegraph wires. There is nowhere left to run that the soldiers cannot follow, and no place left to hide that our own scouts will not reveal." The implications of this assessment settled over the council like a blanket of despair, but Serafina found herself thinking not about endings, but about beginnings. Her months among the Apache had taught her that survival often required abandoning old strategies in favor of innovations that seemed impossible until they became necessary. Perhaps the answer was not to preserve the past unchanged, but to adapt it in ways that could thrive in the emerging future. "What if we stopped trying to hide?" "Ooh," she said quietly, the words escaping before she had fully formed the thought. The council fell silent, every face turning toward her with expressions ranging from surprise to skepticism. As the newest and youngest member of the community, she had no standing to propose radical departures from traditional wisdom. But Nahali gestured for her to continue, and Serafina felt a familiar mixture of terror and exhilaration as she committed herself to an idea that was still taking shape in her mind. General Miles's strategy works because he knows where we are, but we do not know where he is. He has information that we lack, resources that we cannot match, and allies among our own people. Fighting him on his terms means accepting a battle we cannot win. She stood and walked to the edge of the firelight, looking out at the vast darkness of the desert that had become her home. But what if we changed the terms entirely? What if instead of hiding from the white world, we learned to navigate within it? What if we developed our own sources of information, our own allies, our own resources that could match theirs? Zephyr was the first to grasp the implications of what she was suggesting. "You mean espionage," he said slowly. "Infiltration, using their own systems against them." His grandmother had been a master of such tactics during the early years of Apache resistance, gathering intelligence from Mexican settlements while appearing to be nothing more than a harmless old woman selling pottery. "Exactly," Serafina replied, her excitement growing as the possibilities became clearer. "I can pass for Mexican or even American in the right circumstances. I speak multiple languages, understand both cultures, and know how their institutions function. More importantly, I have connections that could be exploited. My father may have disowned me, but his business associates do not know that. His government contacts still remember the Cruz family name. The audacity of the proposal was breathtaking. Instead of remaining hidden in increasingly precarious mountain refuges, she was suggesting that Apache resistance should establish a presence in the very heart of enemy territory. It would require unprecedented cooperation between bands that had traditionally operated independently, and it would demand skills that no Apache leader had ever needed to master. Goyakla leaned forward, his dark eyes reflecting firelight. And something that might have been hope. What exactly are you proposing? How would such a strategy work in practice? His questions were challenging, but not dismissive, suggesting that he was seriously considering possibilities that would have seemed absurd just minutes earlier. Serafina had been thinking about these problems for months, without realizing it, absorbing information about Apache culture and American expansion that now suddenly formed patterns in her mind. We establish agents in major settlements throughout the territory. People who appear to be ordinary Mexican or mixed-blood residents, but who are actually gathering intelligence about troop movements, supply shipments, and military plans. We create a network of communication that rivals the Army's heliograph system. And how do we fund such operations? Asked Desba, her practical mind immediately identifying one of the most significant obstacles. Intelligence gathering requires resources that we do not possess. Agents need places to live, businesses to provide cover stories, money to purchase information from corrupt officials. The traditional Apache economy cannot support such activities. The question forced Serafina to confront the most controversial aspect of her emerging plan. We adapt the economic strategies that have made our enemies successful, she said carefully. Trade, investment, partnership with sympathetic elements in both Mexican and American society. There are people in both cultures who oppose the military's policies for moral or financial reasons. We identify those people and develop mutually beneficial relationships. Chato shook his head skeptically. You are describing cooperation with the same people who have been trying to destroy us for decades. How can we trust them? How can we be certain they will not betray us the moment it becomes convenient? His concerns were shared by most of the council, whose experience with white promises had been uniformly disappointing. We cannot be certain, Serafina admitted. But the alternative is slow extinction through military pressure that we cannot resist using traditional methods. At least this approach offers the possibility of survival through adaptation rather than destruction through stubborn adherence to strategies that no longer work. Her honesty about the risks was more persuasive than false promises would have been. Nahal had been listening to the debate with the thoughtful silence of someone weighing factors that others might not have considered. When she finally spoke, her words carried the authority of age and wisdom that commanded immediate attention from everyone present. The girl speaks of something that my mother attempted during the early years of the Mexican period, she said slowly. Ayana Redstone spent years developing relationships with Mexican traders, learning their language and customs, even attending their religious ceremonies when necessary. She believed that understanding enemies was more valuable than simply killing them, and her intelligence prevented dozens of attacks on Apache camps. Nahali's eyes found Serafina across the fire. But she also warned that such work changes the people who do it, that you cannot spend years pretending to be someone else without losing parts of yourself. The warning was sobering, but not decisive. Every form of resistance carried costs, and the question was not whether to accept risks, but rather which risks offered the best chance of achieving essential objectives. Traditional warfare had protected Apache independence for generations, but it was clearly inadequate for the challenges of the modern era. Over the following days, the council debates continued with increasing intensity and sophistication. Maps were drawn in the sand showing potential locations for intelligence operations. Messengers were dispatched to other bands to gauge their interest in coordinated action. Resources were inventoried to determine what assets could be committed. To such an ambitious undertaking, Serafina found herself at the center of planning sessions that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Her unique combination of cultural knowledge, language skills, and outsider perspective made her indispensable to discussions that ranged from the tactical details of establishing safe houses to the strategic implications of different alliance patterns. But the most significant development was the gradual recognition that she had become more than just a refugee being sheltered by Apache generosity. Her contributions to community survival were substantial and growing, and her integration into Apache society was approaching the point where formal recognition would be appropriate. The implications of this evolution were profound for both her personal relationships and her role in the emerging resistance network. "The council has made a decision," Nahali announced one evening as the camp prepared for another relocation. "You will be formally adopted into the Chiricahua with all the rights and responsibilities that such membership entails. From this day forward, you are no longer Serafina Cruz, daughter of Don Miguel. You are Serafina Redstone, sister to our people and guardian of our future." The ceremony was simple but profound, involving ritual purification, the exchange of traditional gifts, and the recitation of genealogies that connected her symbolically to generations of Apache ancestors. When it was complete, Serafina felt a sense of belonging that was deeper and more satisfying than anything she had experienced in her previous life. But adoption also meant accepting obligations that extended beyond personal desires to encompass the welfare of the entire community. As the newest adult member of the band, she was expected to contribute not just skills and knowledge, but also leadership in areas where her expertise was most relevant. The intelligence network she had proposed was now her responsibility to develop and manage. The first operational test came sooner than anyone expected. A whispered conversation overheard at a trading post suggested that a major military expedition was being organized at Fort Apache, with supplies and personnel being concentrated for what appeared to be a decisive campaign against the remaining free Apache bands. The information was potentially crucial, but it needed verification and elaboration that could only be obtained through close observation. Serafina volunteered for the reconnaissance mission without hesitation, despite the obvious dangers involved. Approaching a military installation required skills she had never tested in actual practice, and discovery would mean death or capture with consequences too terrible to contemplate. But the alternative was allowing her adopted people to face an attack without adequate preparation. The mission required careful preparation and flawless execution. Serafina's appearance had to be adjusted to suggest a mixed-blood trader or ranch hand who might have legitimate business near the fort. Her story had to be detailed enough to withstand casual questioning, but simple enough to remember under pressure. Most importantly, her behavior had to convince observers that she was exactly what she appeared to be, rather than an Apache spy gathering intelligence about military operations. Zephyr insisted on accompanying her, despite the additional risks his presence would create. "You have learned much about survival in Apache country," he said when she objected to his participation. "But this mission takes you back into the white world, where different skills are required. You need someone who can watch your back while you focus on gathering information." Their partnership had evolved into something that transcended simple romantic attraction to encompass genuine intellectual and emotional collaboration. They thought differently but complemented each other's strengths, challenged each other's assumptions while supporting each other's efforts, and had developed the kind of mutual trust that made complex operations possible. The fort reconnaissance proved that their improvised intelligence network could function effectively under real-world conditions. Posing as traders interested in selling horses to the cavalry, they spent 3 days observing troop movements, supply deliveries, and the general state of military preparation. The information they gathered confirmed the worst fears of the Apache. and counsel, while also revealing tactical opportunities that traditional scouting methods would never have discovered. General Miles was indeed organizing a massive campaign designed to end Apache resistance permanently, but the operation was being hampered by logistical problems and internal disagreements about strategy. More importantly, there were officers within the military establishment who questioned the ethics and effectiveness of the total war approach, creating potential sources of intelligence and even limited cooperation. When they returned to camp, with their findings, Serafina and Zephyr were greeted as heroes whose courage and competence had potentially saved dozens of lives. But they were also recognized as pioneers of a new form of warfare that would require unprecedented changes in Apache society. The success of their mission proved that adaptation was possible, but it also demonstrated that such adaptation would demand sacrifices that no one had fully anticipated. The betrayal came from an unexpected source, delivered by someone whose loyalty had never been questioned until the moment she chose silver coins over sacred bonds. Maria Hernandez had been one of Serafina's most trusted agents, a seamstress in Tucson whose shop served as both safe house and communication hub for the growing intelligence network. For 8 months, she had provided reliable information about cavalry movements and territorial politics while maintaining perfect operational security. Her decision to accept General Miles's bounty money changed everything. The first sign of compromise was subtle. A routine message that should have arrived on Tuesday reached the Apache camp on Friday, 3 days late and bearing signs of having been opened and resealed. Zephyr noticed the tampering immediately, his trained eye catching details that would have escaped less experienced operatives. The delay could have been explained by weather or transport difficulties, but the careful manipulation of the wax seals suggested deliberate interference. "Someone has been reading our correspondence," he reported to Serafina as they examined the compromised dispatch in the privacy of their shared wiki-up. The message itself contained nothing particularly sensitive, just routine updates about supply deliveries and personnel changes at Fort Lowell. But its compromise implied that their entire communication system might be penetrated. Serafina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind whistling through the canyon walls. The intelligence network she had spent months building represented more than just tactical advantage. It was the foundation of Apache survival strategy for the modern era. If that foundation was cracking, then everything they had worked to achieve was in jeopardy. More immediately, if their operations were being monitored, then every agent in the field was in mortal danger. The investigation that followed revealed the scope of the disaster with methodical precision. Maria had not just sold information about current operations. She had provided General Miles with detailed maps of safe houses, lists of agent identities, and copies of intercepted messages dating back to the network's inception. The betrayal was so comprehensive that it suggested months of careful documentation, rather than a sudden decision motivated by temporary financial pressure. "She has been working for them from the beginning," Desba concluded, after reviewing the evidence they had managed to gather. The revelation was particularly painful because Maria's recruitment had been Serafina's personal responsibility, based on character assessments that now appeared catastrophically flawed. The seamstress had not been corrupted by American gold. She had been an American asset from her first day of supposed Apache service. The immediate response required abandoning established procedures that had taken months to develop and implement. Every safe house had to be evacuated, every communication channel had to be changed, and every agent had to be warned that their identities might be known to enemy intelligence services. The work of rebuilding would require starting from zero, while under active surveillance by hostile forces, but the deeper problem was psychological rather than operational. The betrayal had shattered confidence in the fundamental premise of Serafina's strategy, which depended on the possibility of finding trustworthy allies within enemy society. If someone as thoroughly vetted as Maria could be a double agent, then how could they trust anyone? If American intelligence services were sophisticated enough to plant long-term operatives, then how could Apache espionage compete against professional organizations with unlimited resources? Perhaps the old ways were better after all, Goyakla said during an emergency council session convened to address the crisis. His words carried weight not just because of his military reputation, but because he had been one of the earliest supporters of Serafina's intelligence approach. If he was having second thoughts, then other leaders would likely follow his example. The warrior's skepticism was understandable and shared by many council members who had always harbored doubts about cooperation with outsiders. Traditional Apache warfare might have become more difficult in the modern era, but at least it was straightforward. You knew who your enemies were, you fought them directly, and you didn't have to worry about allies who might be secretly working for the other side. Serafina understood that her response to this crisis would determine not just the future of Apache resistance strategy, but also her own standing within the community that had adopted her. If she collapsed under pressure or retreated from the challenges that betrayal had revealed, then her experiment in cultural adaptation would be judged a failure. But if she could find a way forward that addressed legitimate concerns while preserving essential innovations, then the network might emerge stronger than before. The betrayal teaches us something important about our enemies, she said slowly, choosing her words with care. They understand the value of intelligence work well enough to invest significant resources in penetrating our operations. That suggests we were succeeding well enough to frighten them. If our efforts were ineffective, they would not have bothered with such elaborate countermeasures. The argument was logically sound, but emotionally unsatisfying to people who were grieving the loss of agents who had been captured or killed because of Maria's treachery. Logic alone would not restore confidence in a strategy that had proven vulnerable to the oldest form of warfare, turning enemies against each other through bribes, threats, or ideological manipulation. What was needed was not just rational analysis, but also emotional healing, and that healing would have to begin with acknowledging the full scope of what had been lost. The intelligence network had been more than just a collection of information sources. It had been a symbol of hope that Apache people could master the tools of modern warfare well enough to compete with their technologically superior enemies. We trusted too quickly and verified too little, Serafina admitted to the assembled council. I was so eager to prove that cooperation across cultural boundaries was possible that I ignored warning signs that should have been obvious. Maria's information was always accurate, but it was also never quite as detailed as it should have been from someone in her position. She knew enough to be useful, but not enough to be truly valuable. The admission of error was politically risky because it provided ammunition for critics who had opposed the intelligence strategy from the beginning, but it was also necessary for rebuilding credibility with people whose trust had been damaged by operational failures. Leadership in Apache society required the ability to acknowledge mistakes while demonstrating that those mistakes had produced wisdom rather than just regret. Over the following weeks, a new approach emerged from the wreckage of the old one, incorporating lessons learned through bitter experience with betrayal and deception. Instead of relying on individual agents whose loyalty could be purchased or coerced, the revised network would operate through family connections that were much harder to penetrate or corrupt. Instead of centralizing information flow through vulnerable communication hubs, intelligence would be distributed through multiple redundant channels that could continue operating even if several components were compromised. The rebuilding process brought Serafina and Zephyr closer together than ever before, as they worked 18-hour days developing new operational procedures, while supporting each other through the emotional aftermath of professional failure and personal loss. Their partnership had evolved beyond romance, or even marriage, into something resembling a meeting of minds that transcended individual identity. "We think differently about problems," Zephyr observed one evening, as they reviewed plans for the restructured network. "You approach challenges like a trader, looking for ways to create mutual benefit. I approach them like a warrior, looking for ways to neutralize threats. Together we see possibilities that neither of us would discover alone." Their collaboration had indeed produced innovations that drew on both Apache tactical traditions and Mexican commercial practices, creating hybrid approaches that were more sophisticated than either culture might have developed independently. The new intelligence network incorporated warrior skills like reconnaissance and stealth, with trader skills like negotiation and relationship management. But the most significant development was personal rather than professional. As winter approached and the band prepared for the difficult season ahead, Serafina realized that her feelings for Zephyr had deepened into something that demanded formal recognition. Their relationship had grown beyond convenience or even affection into a genuine spiritual partnership that deserved to be celebrated and protected through traditional ceremony. The Apache marriage customs she had learned about during her cultural education were more complex than the simple exchange of vows that characterized Mexican Catholic weddings. Marriage among the Chiricahua was understood as an alliance between families rather than just individuals, requiring negotiations about responsibilities, resources, and the welfare of future children. Since Serafina had no biological family among the Apache, Nahali would serve as her formal representative in the discussions that preceded any wedding ceremony. "You understand that marrying Zephyr means more than just sharing his dwelling," the older woman explained during one of their private conversations about the implications of such a union. "It means accepting responsibility for his reputation within the community, supporting his decisions even when you disagree with them, and raising children who will be fully Apache regardless of their mixed heritage." The requirements were sobering, but not discouraging. Serafina had already committed herself to Apache society in ways that made retreat impossible, and her relationship with Zephyr had become so central to her identity that formal marriage seemed like recognition of existing reality rather than a significant change in their circumstances. But there was also the question of timing, which raised strategic considerations that extended beyond personal desires to encompass the welfare of the entire resistance network. Marriage would provide emotional stability and social recognition that could enhance their effectiveness as intelligence operatives, but it would also create vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit. Married couples were more predictable than individuals, more likely to take risks to protect each other, and more susceptible to pressure applied through threats to their spouse. General Miles had demonstrated his willingness to use such pressure when dealing with Apache prisoners, offering better treatment for captives whose relatives surrendered voluntarily. If Serafina and Zephyr were married, their relationship would become a potential weapon in enemy hands, something that could be threatened or destroyed to influence their behavior during critical operations. "The risks are real," Zephyr acknowledged when they discussed these concerns, "but so are the benefits. Marriage would formalize our partnership in ways that could strengthen our work rather than weakening it. We would no longer have to maintain separate identities during extended operations. We could present ourselves as a married couple, which would provide better cover for some types of intelligence gathering." His practical argument was persuasive, but the emotional argument was even stronger. They had found in each other a rare combination of intellectual compatibility, shared values, and genuine affection that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. Such connections were precious enough to deserve protection and celebration regardless of external pressures. The marriage ceremony took place on a clear December morning when the desert air was sharp with cold and bright with promise. Nahali presided over the traditional rituals that bound them not just to each other, but to the community that had made their union possible. When the formal obligations were completed, they were recognized as full partners in every aspect of Apache life. But even as they celebrated their personal happiness, larger forces were moving toward a confrontation that would test everything they had built together. The reconstructed intelligence network was reporting increased military activity throughout the Southwest, suggesting that General Miles was preparing for a final campaign that would either end Apache resistance permanently or force the remaining free bands to accept reservation life. The information was fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, but the overall pattern was clear enough to demand immediate attention. Troop concentrations were increasing at multiple locations, supply shipments were being accelerated, and most ominously, Apache scouts were being recruited in unprecedented numbers. Miles was apparently convinced that previous campaigns had failed because they relied too heavily on conventional military tactics rather than the irregular warfare techniques that had proven effective against other Apache leaders. "He is learning from his mistakes," Chatto reported after returning from a reconnaissance mission to Fort Apache. The new strategy uses small units of Apache scouts supported by regular cavalry moving quickly through terrain that larger formations cannot navigate. They are not trying to defeat us in pitched battles. They are trying to exhaust us through constant pressure that makes normal life impossible. The assessment was sobering because it suggested that Miles had identified the fundamental weakness of Apache resistance strategy. Traditional guerrilla warfare depended on the ability to strike quickly and then disappear into secure base areas where enemies could not follow. But if those base areas were being systematically mapped and penetrated by Apache scouts working for the army, then the entire foundation of resistance was crumbling. As 1880 dawned cold and uncertain, Serafina found herself facing the greatest challenge of her young life. The intelligence network she had rebuilt was functioning effectively, but the information it provided painted an increasingly bleak picture of Apache prospects for continued independence. The marriage that had brought her such personal joy was also a reminder that she now had responsibilities to protect not just herself, but also the man she loved and the community that had embraced them both. The question that haunted her dreams was whether love and loyalty would be enough to overcome the overwhelming odds they faced, or whether the forces of history and technology had already rendered Apache resistance obsolete regardless of how courageously or cleverly it was conducted. The answer would determine not just their personal fate, but the survival of an entire way of life. The telegram that changed everything arrived at Fort Apache on March 15, 1881, transmitted through the Army's heliograph network with the urgency reserved for communications that could alter the course of history. General Nelson Miles read it twice before summoning his staff officers, the implications so profound that he needed confirmation before acting on information that contradicted months of strategic planning. The message was brief but decisive. President Garfield wanted an immediate end to Apache hostilities through negotiation rather than continued warfare. Political pressure from Eastern humanitarian groups had finally overcome military arguments for total suppression, creating an opportunity that no one in the Southwest had expected. The new administration was sensitive to criticism that the Army's tactics amounted to genocide, and congressional hearings had revealed embarrassing details about the use of Apache scouts to hunt their own people. What had been presented as necessary security measures were now being characterized as violations of basic moral principles. But Miles understood that presidential orders were just the beginning of a complex process that would require careful management to avoid disaster for both sides. Apache leaders had no reason to trust American promises after decades of broken treaties and unpunished massacres, while territorial officials and military commanders had their own reasons to prefer continuation of existing policies. Successful negotiations would require intermediaries who could bridge the gap between radically different worldviews. The general's thoughts turned immediately to the intelligence reports he had been receiving about an unusual Apache operative who appeared to be coordinating resistance activities with unprecedented sophistication. Serafina Redstone had been described by captured agents as a Mexican woman who had somehow achieved high status within Chiricahua society, serving as both strategic planner and diplomatic liaison for bands that had previously operated independently. If those reports were accurate, she might be exactly the kind of intermediary that successful negotiations would require. Meanwhile, in the hidden canyon that had served as winter quarters for Nahale's band, Serafina was wrestling with intelligence reports that painted an increasingly complex picture of American intentions. The flow of contradictory information suggested either confusion within enemy ranks or deliberate deception designed to manipulate Apache decision-making. Some sources reported massive military buildups that indicated preparation for total war, while others suggested political developments that might favor negotiated settlement. "The patterns do not make sense," she admitted to Zephyr as they reviewed the latest dispatches from their rebuilt network. "Either General Miles is preparing for the largest campaign in the history of Apache warfare, or he is being ordered to suspend military operations entirely. Our agents cannot all be wrong, but their reports describe completely different realities." Zephyr had been studying the tactical implications of various scenarios, trying to prepare defensive plans that could address multiple contingencies. Simultaneously, perhaps both reports are true, he suggested. Military preparations continue because field commanders need to be ready for warfare. But political negotiations are also beginning because Washington wants alternatives to endless conflict. The contradiction might reflect disagreement within the American system rather than deception by our sources. The analysis was compelling because it explained not just the conflicting intelligence, but also certain inconsistencies in recent military behavior. Army units had been positioned for major operations, but had not launched the attacks that such positioning would normally precede. Supply convoys had been dispatched, but then recalled without explanation. Most tellingly, Apache scouts had been recruited in large numbers, but had not been deployed in the systematic campaigns that their presence would suggest. As spring progressed and the contradictions persisted, Serafina began to suspect that the Americans were facing the same strategic dilemma that had long plagued Apache resistance: how to achieve decisive victory against enemies who refused to fight conventional battles on predictable terms. Military force could win individual engagements, but it could not resolve the fundamental political problems that sustained conflict between incompatible ways of life. The breakthrough came through an unexpected channel, delivered by Father Juan Martinez, a Franciscan priest whose mission served both Mexican settlers and peaceful Apache families living near the reservation boundaries. Father Martinez had been contacted by Army representatives seeking someone who could approach Apache leaders with informal proposals for ending hostilities through means other than military defeat. "They want to talk," the priest reported during a clandestine meeting arranged through one of Serafina's most trusted agents. "General Miles has been authorized to explore negotiated solutions, but he needs assurance that Apache representatives can speak for all the free bands rather than just individual groups. The Americans have learned that treaties with single leaders are worthless if other leaders reject those agreements. The proposal was simultaneously encouraging and terrifying in its implications. Successful negotiations could end the constant threat of military attack and provide security for Apache communities that had been living under siege for years. But failed negotiations could provide justification for renewed warfare, conducted with even greater brutality than before, as military commanders could claim they had exhausted diplomatic alternatives. More fundamentally, negotiations would require Apache leaders to make decisions that no previous generation had faced. Traditional Apache society had never developed institutions capable of binding all bands to agreements made by representative leaders. Each group maintained sovereign authority over its own territory and affairs, accepting or rejecting alliances based on immediate self-interest rather than abstract principles of collective action. We need a new kind of leadership structure, Serafina realized, as she discussed the implications with Nahale and other senior members of the band. Someone who can speak for Apache interests generally, rather than just defending the concerns of individual groups. But creating such leadership means changing fundamental aspects of how our society has always functioned. The challenge was not just political, but also personal, because Serafina's unique position made her the most logical candidate for such a role, despite her recent adoption into Apache society. Her cultural knowledge, language skills, and intelligence network provided assets that no traditional leader possessed. But her mixed heritage and gender created obstacles that Apache society had never had to navigate. Nahal was characteristically direct in her assessment of the situation. "You are the person best prepared for this responsibility," she told Serafina during one of their private conversations. "But accepting it means risking everything you have built here for the possibility of something that has never been attempted. If negotiations succeed, you will be remembered as the person who saved Apache independence. If they fail, you will be blamed for trusting enemies who were never sincere about peace." The stakes involved more than just personal reputation or even Apache survival as a people. Successful negotiations could establish precedents for resolving conflicts between indigenous populations and expanding industrial societies throughout the American West. Failed negotiations could justify policies of cultural destruction that would make previous military campaigns seem restrained by comparison. After weeks of internal debate, the Apache Council reached a consensus that surprised everyone, including the participants themselves. Instead of selecting a single representative to negotiate with American officials, they chose to create a delegation that included both traditional war leaders and innovative strategists like Serafina. The approach acknowledged that successful diplomacy would require both cultural authenticity and tactical sophistication. The negotiations took place at a remote trading post near the Mexican border, chosen because its location provided security for both sides while offering escape routes if discussions broke down into renewed hostilities. General Miles arrived with a small staff and minimal military escort, demonstrating American sincerity about pursuing diplomatic rather than military solutions. The Apache delegation was equally modest in size, but unprecedented in its representative authority. Serafina found herself serving as primary translator and cultural interpreter for discussions that ranged across decades of accumulated grievances and misunderstandings. Each side entered the negotiations with assumptions about the other that proved to be partially accurate but fundamentally incomplete, requiring patient explanation of perspectives that had never been clearly articulated across cultural boundaries. "We are not asking you to become Americans," General Miles explained during one of the early sessions. "We are asking you to accept that American expansion is inevitable and to find ways of preserving Apache culture within that reality. The alternative is continued warfare that can only end with Apache extinction as a people." The general's honesty was refreshing after years of diplomatic language designed to obscure rather than clarify American intentions. But his assessment of Apache options was also brutal in its implications. Acceptance of American sovereignty meant abandoning the territorial independence that had defined Apache identity for centuries, while rejection meant facing military pressure that would only intensify with each passing year. "You speak of preserving our culture," Goyakla replied through Serafina's translation. "But culture cannot be separated from the land that shaped it or the freedom to live according to ancestral wisdom. What you offer is not preservation, but transformation into something that may bear Apache names but will not possess Apache souls." The exchanges continued for days, with both sides gradually developing more nuanced understanding of interests and constraints that shaped their respective positions. American officials learned that Apache resistance was not motivated by simple hostility to progress, but by genuine fear that cultural assimilation meant cultural death. Apache leaders learned that American expansion was not driven by personal hatred, but by economic and demographic forces that individual officials could not control even if they wanted to. Gradually, the outline of a possible agreement began to emerge from the seemingly irreconcilable differences that had sustained decades of conflict. Apache bands would accept reservation boundaries and nominal American sovereignty in exchange for guaranteed rights to practice traditional customs, maintain tribal government structures, and control internal affairs without interference from territorial officials. But the most innovative aspect of the proposed treaty involved Serafina's intelligence network, which would be transformed from a resistance organization into a liaison service that facilitated communication between Apache communities and American authorities. Instead of gathering military intelligence, the network would monitor compliance with treaty provisions and provide early warning of problems before they escalated into violence. "You are proposing to institutionalize the very capabilities that made you such formidable enemies," General Miles observed, with something that might have been admiration. "Converting your intelligence assets into diplomatic resources while preserving the operational skills that created them. It is either brilliant strategy or elaborate preparation for renewed warfare when circumstances change." Serafina met his gaze directly, her Spanish precise and her tone carefully neutral. "It is both, General. We are choosing cooperation because we believe it offers better prospects for Apache survival than continued resistance, but we are also ensuring that if cooperation fails, we will be prepared to resume resistance from a stronger position than we occupy today." The honesty was risky, but also essential for establishing the mutual respect that sustainable agreements required. Neither side could afford to base treaties on assumptions that the other party was abandoning fundamental interests or capabilities, because such assumptions would inevitably prove false when tested by changing circumstances. When the negotiations concluded after 2 weeks of intensive discussions, both sides had achieved more than they had expected while accepting limitations they had not originally contemplated. Apache bands would retain more autonomy than American officials had initially considered possible, while accepting more integration with American institutions than Apache leaders had thought acceptable. The signing ceremony was deliberately modest, reflecting awareness that the real test of the agreement would come during implementation rather than negotiation. Treaties were promises about future behavior, and their value depended entirely on the willingness of both sides to honor commitments when doing so became difficult or expensive. But for Serafina, the ceremony marked something more profound than just the end of one phase of Apache-American relations and the beginning of another. It represented validation of the strategic vision she had developed during her transformation from privileged Mexican rancher's daughter to Apache diplomat and intelligence coordinator. "You have created something new in the world," Zephyr told her as they prepared to return to their people with news of the agreement. Not just a treaty, but a new way of thinking about how different peoples can coexist without one destroying the other. Whether it succeeds will depend on choices made by people we will never meet, but the possibility exists now when it did not exist before. Years later, when historians assessed the period that became known as the Apache Peace, they would debate whether the agreements reached at that remote trading post represented genuine reconciliation or merely temporary accommodation between irreconcilable worldviews. Some would argue that the treaties preserved essential aspects of Apache culture while allowing adaptation to changing circumstances, while others would claim that any accommodation with American expansion inevitably led to cultural extinction. But for the people who lived through those changes, the debate was less important than the daily reality of building lives that honored both their heritage and their hopes for the future. Serafina and Zephyr raised children who spoke Apache and Spanish and English, who learned traditional hunting skills and modern business practices, who understood that strength could take many forms, including the wisdom to choose battles worth fighting. The intelligence network evolved into something unprecedented in American-Indian relations, a native-controlled institution that facilitated communication between tribal communities and federal authorities while preserving operational independence and cultural integrity. It became a model that other tribes studied and adapted, demonstrating that resistance and cooperation were not necessarily opposite strategies, but could be complementary approaches to the same fundamental challenge of cultural survival. When Serafina was old and her hair had turned the same silver as Nahali's had been, she would sit with her grandchildren around evening fires and tell them stories about the morning when she walked barefoot in snow as punishment for refusing an unwanted marriage, and how an Apache warrior's blanket had changed the course of two people's destinies. She would teach them that love could transcend cultural boundaries while respecting cultural differences, that strength sometimes meant fighting and sometimes meant negotiating, and that the most important battles were often won through patience rather than violence. The children would listen with the wide eyes of youth encountering possibilities they had never imagined, and some would grow up to become leaders who carried those lessons into challenges their grandmother could never have anticipated. They would understand that identity was not something fixed and inherited, but something chosen and created through decisions made daily in circumstances that required both courage and wisdom. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.